We don't serve bikers, the manager sneered as six patched Hells Angels strode into the city's most exclusive restaurant. He was entirely oblivious to the way the rumble of their engines had just rattled the fine crystal and shaken the wealthy patrons to their marrow. Within 3 minutes, that misplaced arrogance would cause his entire world to collapse. The Oak Haven Brasserie was the kind of establishment that prided itself on exclusivity over hospitality. Nestled in the affluent, meticulously manicured hills of Monterey County, California, the restaurant was a fortress of pretension. Imported Italian marble floors gleamed under the soft, ambient glow of hand-blown crystal chandeliers. The menu featured absurdly priced delicacies like white truffle foam and gold leaf wagyu, catered specifically to tech billionaires, retired hedge fund managers, and local politicians. At the center of this culinary temple stood Rickarian Sander, the general manager and minority owner. Rickarian was a man whose entire identity was wrapped in tailored Italian suits and a superiority complex that preceded him into every room. He ran Oak Haven with a draconian fist, treating his wealthy guests like royalty and his staff like disposable commodities. Today, a crisp Sunday afternoon was particularly vital. Rumor had it that a scout from the James Beard Foundation was dining in the main hall, and Rickarian was determined to ensure the service was nothing short of a choreographed ballet of perfection. Lydia, Rickarian snapped, his voice a harsh whisper as he cornered his head hostess near the reservations podium. Table 4 needs their water glasses refilled. And for God's sake, stand up straight. You're slouching like a dock worker. We are projecting elegance today. Lydia Jenkins, a 22-year-old college student, working 2 jobs to pay off her mounting tuition debt, swallowed her pride and nodded. Right away, Mr. Sander, she hurried away, grabbing a silver pitcher. The restaurant was operating at a low, sophisticated hum, clinking silverware, soft jazz playing from hidden speakers, and the hushed murmurs of the elite discussing stock portfolios and country club gossip filled the air. Then the hum was shattered. It started as a low, guttural vibration, a mechanical growl that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The soft jazz was entirely drowned out. The heavy mahogany front doors of Oak Haven trembled in their frames. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Outside, the unmistakable, thunderous roar of heavily modified Harley-Davidson V-twin engines echoed through the valet parking lot. Not just one or two, half a dozen of them. Rickarian's face flushed with immediate, visceral irritation. He adjusted his silk tie and marched briskly toward the floor-to-ceiling tinted windows. Through the glass he watched in horror as 6 massive motorcycles rolled past the panicked valet attendants, ignoring the VIP parking signs, and parked directly on the imported cobblestone walkway leading to the front entrance. The engines cut out in unison, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. "Lock the doors," Rickarian hissed, turning to the nearest busboy. "Lock them right now. Just you late." The heavy mahogany doors swung open. The contrast was jarring, almost comical, like a pack of wolves wandering into a poodle show. 6 men stepped into the pristine foyer. They were large, weather-beaten, and clad in heavy denim and worn black leather. Heavy silver chains hung from their waists, and thick boots scuffed the flawless marble. But it was the patches on their backs that made the blood drain from the faces of the patrons nearest the door. The winged death head. The curved top rocker reading Hells Angels. The bottom rocker reading California. Leading the pack was a man who looked like he had been carved out of a granite mountainside. Jim Callahan, the president of the local charter, stood 6'4". His beard was thick and shot through with gray, and his eyes, hidden behind dark aviator sunglasses, scanned the room with a terrifying calmness. Flanking him were 2 equally imposing men, Thomas "Tommy Gunn" Miller, whose arms were entirely covered in faded prison ink, and Arthur Artie Rossi, a man chewing a toothpick with an expression of sheer, unadulterated boredom. The smell of exhaust, old leather, and stale tobacco instantly overpowered the delicate scent of the lavender diffusers Ricarian had placed in the lobby. Ricarian stepped forward, blocking their path to the main dining room. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project an authority he suddenly did not feel. "Gentlemen," Ricarian said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you are in the wrong place. I must ask you to leave immediately." Jim Callahan didn't stop walking until he was mere inches from Ricarian. The sheer size of the biker forced the restaurant manager to crane his neck upward. Jim slowly reached up and pulled off his aviator sunglasses, revealing pale, icy blue eyes that locked onto Ricarian with laser precision. "They're not here for the white truffle foam, pal," Jim said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that carried across the silent dining room. "I don't care what you are here for," Ricarian replied, his tone rising in pitch as panic began to war with his arrogance. He noticed a few of his wealthiest patrons subtly reaching for their phones, while others were already signaling for their checks. The pristine facade of his restaurant was crumbling by the second. "This is a private establishment. We have a strict dress code. No cuts, no gang attire, and certainly no whatever it is you call yourselves. We don't serve bikers here. Get out before I have you removed." Tommy Gunn chuckled, a low, rasping sound. He crossed his massive arms over his chest. "Removed? By who? The valet kid in the bow tie? I will call the Monterey County Sheriff's Department," Ricarian threatened, pointing a manicured finger toward the door. "The chief of police dines here every Thursday. Do not test me." Jim Callahan didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply offered a slow, chilling smile. "Go ahead, Ricarian," Gim said softly. "Call them. In fact, you might want them here for this." Ricarian froze. The use of his first name threw him off balance. How did this giant of a man, a criminal in his eyes, know who he was? He wasn't wearing a name tag. Sesk. "Lydia?" Ricarian barked, not breaking eye contact with Jim. "Silveria, get over here and dial 911. Tell them we have an aggressive trespass situation." Lydia, who had been watching the exchange from behind the host stand, stepped forward hesitantly. Her hands were shaking. She looked at Ricarian, then looked up at Jim Callahan. To Ricarian's absolute bewilderment, the terrifying biker's expression softened for a fraction of a second as he looked at the young waitress. "You don't want to do that, Lydia," Jim said gently. "This doesn't involve you. Just stand back. I gave you an order." Ricarian screamed, losing the last of his carefully cultivated composure. Spittle flew from his lips. "Call the police right now, or you are fired." "You hear me? You're done." Lydia stopped, tears welling in her eyes. She desperately needed this job. Her rent was due in 3 days. But there was something in Jim Callahan's eyes, a quiet, absolute certainty that rooted her to the spot. She placed the phone down on the podium. "Sorry, Mr. Sander," Lydia whispered, taking a step back. I can't." "Fine, you're fired. Get your things and get out," Ricarian spat, turning his furious gaze back to Jim. "You see what you've done? You're disrupting my business. You are terrorizing my staff. The only one terrorizing that girl is you, Dick," Artie chimed in from the back, shifting the toothpick from one side of his mouth to the other. "And frankly, you're bad for business." "Enough," Ricarian hissed, reaching into his own tailored pocket for his smartphone. "I'm calling the authorities myself. You thugs are going to spend the night in a cell." Before Ricarian could dial the first digit, Jim Callahan reached into his leather vest. The movement was smooth but sudden enough that Ricarian flinched, instinctively taking a step back, perhaps expecting a weapon. Instead, Jim pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. He tossed it onto the pristine marble host stand. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "You're not calling anyone, Ricarian," Jim said, his voice dropping an octave, losing any trace of amusement. "Because you don't own this building. You lease it. And the person you lease it from has had enough of your games." Ricarian scoffed, though a bead of sweat began to form at his temple. "I don't know what you were talking about. I deal directly with a property management trust." You deal with Beatrice Higgins," Jim interrupted, stepping closer, closing the distance until Ricarian could smell the old motor oil and mint gum on the biker's breath. "An 82-year-old widow who you've been scamming for the past 3 years." The color drained completely from Ricarian's face. The mention of the name struck him like a physical blow. Beatrice Higgins. Yes, she was the legal owner of the prime real estate upon which Oakhaven Brasserie sat. When Ricarian first signed the lease, he assumed she was just a senile, lonely old woman with no family to protect her. For 36 months, Ricarian had been submitting fraudulent invoices for structural repairs, plumbing emergencies, and electrical upgrades, all fabricated, deducting tens of thousands of dollars from his monthly rent payments. He knew the old woman was living on a fixed income, and his ultimate goal was to bankrupt her, force her to sell the property to him at a fraction of its value, and finally own the land his restaurant stood on. "I have a legal lease," Ricarian stammered, his voice suddenly hollow. "My rent is paid according to the stipulations of property maintenance. If Mrs. Higgins has a dispute, she can contact my attorneys." "She doesn't need your attorneys," Jim said calmly. He nodded over his shoulder to Tommy Gunn. "Tommy, get the door for the lady." Tommy grinned, a wide, predatory smile, and pushed the heavy mahogany doors open once more. The dining room, which had been frozen in a state of terrified silence, watched as a small, frail-looking woman stepped into the restaurant. She wore a neatly pressed floral dress, a beige cardigan, and a pearl necklace. She walked with a silver-handled cane, her steps slow but deliberate, but it wasn't her frail appearance that shocked Ricarian. It was the fact that she was flanked by 2 more massive, leather-clad Hell's Angels who treated her with the kind of reverence usually reserved for royalty. One of them held the door, the other gently offered his arm, which she politely declined with a warm smile. "Thank you, boys," Beatrice Higgins said, her voice thin but remarkably clear. She walked past the burly bikers, stopping right next to Jim Callahan. Jim looked down at the elderly woman, his intimidating demeanor vanishing entirely. He placed a massive, heavily tattooed hand gently on her shoulder. "Everything okay, Mama B?" Guy Hume asked softly. I'm quite all right, Jimmy," Beatrice replied, patting his hand. She then turned her gaze to Ricarian Sander. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened steel that looked incredibly out of place on a sweet old grandmother. Ricarian?" Beatrice said. "Mrs. Higgins?" Ricarian choked out, his eyes darting frantically between the frail woman and the heavily armed bikers surrounding her. What is the meaning of this? Why are these men with you?" Beatrice let out a dry, humorless chuckle. She leaned heavily on her cane and looked around the opulent restaurant, taking in the crystal, the marble, and the terrified wealthy patrons. "You see, Ricarian," Beatrice began, her voice carrying through the silent room. "So, when my husband passed away 15 years ago, he left me this property. It was his retirement investment. You probably thought I was just a helpless old widow you could bully out of her deed." She took a step closer to Ricarian, and Jim Callahan stepped right beside her, an imposing shadow. "But what you failed to research, Ricarian," Beatrice continued, her eyes narrowing, "was who my husband was. His name was Edward Higgins. But around here, everyone just called him Iron Eddie. A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the older patrons in the room who remembered local history. "Ugh, Iron Eddie," Jim Callahan added, his voice echoing like thunder in the quiet room, was one of the founding members of the California Charter of the Hells Angels. He built this brotherhood, which makes Beatrice our mother. Ricarian's knees went weak. The polished Italian marble beneath his expensive shoes suddenly felt like thin ice, and it was cracking fast. "And Ricarion," Beatrice said, tapping her cane on the floor for emphasis. "You owe me $420,000 in back rent." The silence in the Oak Haven brasserie was absolute, broken only by the soft clinking of ice melting in untouched water glasses. Ricarian Sanders stared at the frail 82-year-old woman standing before him, his mind desperately trying to process the catastrophic shift in reality. Beatrice Higgins, the woman he had dismissed as a senile, easy mark, was the matriarch of the most notorious motorcycle club in the state. $420,000, Ricarian repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He forced a strained, dismissive laugh, looking around at his wealthy patrons, hoping to find an ally. None met his eye. "Mrs. Higgins, this is absurd. As I stated, the deductions for my lease payments were strictly for structural maintenance. The building is decades old. It required extensive retrofitting. I have the invoices. I have the paperwork." Jim Callahan, still standing like a monolith beside Beatrice, slowly shook his head. "Paperwork. Right. We brought some of that, too." Jim snapped his fingers. From the back of the pack, a biker stepped forward. Unlike Tommy Gunn or Artie, this man didn't look like a brawler. He was leaner, wearing wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, his graying hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. His leather cut bore the patched SHD at arms, but the man carried a sleek, black leather briefcase that looked entirely out of place alongside his heavy boots and silver chains. "Ricarian, meet Nathaniel," Jim said, a dark amusement coloring his tone. "Nate's been with the club for 30 years. He also happens to hold a master's degree in forensic accounting from Stanford. He's a CPA. We asked him to take a little look at those invoices you've been mailing to Mama B." Nathaniel clicked the briefcase open, resting it casually on a nearby empty table 4. The very table Ricarian had been obsessing over just 10 minutes prior. He pulled out a thick stack of spreadsheets and a red ink pen. "Mr. Sander," Nathaniel began, his voice surprisingly mild, sounding more like a college professor than a Hell's Angel. "Let's review, shall we? In March of last year, you deducted $55,000 for a complete overhaul of the commercial HVAC system. You submitted an invoice from a company called Apex Climate Solutions." Ricarian swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. His impeccably tailored suit suddenly felt like a straitjacket. Yes, the old system was failing. It was a health code violation waiting to happen. "Interesting," Nathaniel said, tapping the spreadsheet with his red pen. "Because Apex Climate Solutions dissolved its LLC 5 years ago. I pulled the corporate registry filings. Furthermore, I had one of our associates who the licensed union HVAC contractor inspect your roof last night. You are currently running the exact same train units that Iron Eddie installed in 1998. They haven't been touched, aside from routine filter changes." A murmur rippled through the dining room. At a corner booth, a distinguished-looking man in a tweed blazer, Harrison Cole, the rumored scout for the James Beard Foundation, pulled out a small leather-bound notebook and began furiously writing. He wasn't reviewing the food anymore. He was documenting a criminal unmasking. That's a misunderstanding," Ricarian stammered, his voice rising in panic. "My assistant handled the contractors. I sign off on thousands of documents a month." "Let's move on to the foundation work," Nathaniel continued relentlessly, pulling another sheet from the stack. $80,000 deducted last November for seismic retrofitting by a company registered to a PO box in Nevada. A PO box that, coincidentally, is registered to your brother-in-law, David. Ricarian took a step back, bumping into the host podium. His chest heaved. He had thought he was so clever. He had assumed that Beatrice, living alone in her modest bungalow, would simply file the paperwork away and accept the reduced checks. He never imagined she would have a team of highly protective, wildly resourceful outlaws auditing his shell games. "You have no right to investigate me," Ricarian shouted, his facade of elegance completely shattering. He pointed a trembling finger at the bikers. "This is harassment. This is extortion. You come into my restaurant." "It is not your restaurant," Beatrice interrupted, her voice cutting through his hysterics like a steel blade. She stepped forward, her silver-handled cane tapping against the marble. "You own the equipment, Ricarian. You own the overpriced silverware. But you do not own the walls. You do not own the earth beneath it. And as of this morning, according to the morality clause you so arrogantly ignored in Section 4 of our lease agreement, you are in breach of contract. You can't prove anything," Ricarian hissed, a desperate, cornered animal. "I'll tie this up in civil court for a decade. You'll be dead before you see a dime, you old hag." The room went completely dead. The air pressure in the restaurant seemed to drop. Tommy Gunn stopped smiling. Artie spat his toothpick onto the pristine floor. Jim Callahan took one massive step forward, completely eclipsing Beatrice, his pale blue eyes practically glowing with sudden lethal intent. "You want to rephrase that, Dick?" Jim asked, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that promised violence. Before Ricarian could utter another word, the heavy wooden doors of the kitchen swung open. The head chef, a temperamental Frenchman named Leroy, burst out, a meat cleaver still in his hand, oblivious to the tension in the dining room. "Ricarian, the supplier is on the phone. They are holding the truffle shipment because the credit card declined," Laurent yelled, freezing as he suddenly noticed the massive bikers occupying his dining room. "What is happening here?" Nathaniel, the accountant, adjusted his glasses and looked at Laurent. "Mr. Sanders' business accounts have been frozen. We filed an emergency injunction with the county courts at 8 a.m. yesterday, citing felony embezzlement and elder fraud. The bank complied this morning." Ricarian's knees finally gave out. He slumped against the reservation podium, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, his silk tie askew, his perfectly gelled hair falling into his face. His empire was systematically being dismantled in front of the very people he had spent years trying to impress. "You've ruined me," Ricarian whispered, staring at the floorboards. "You've completely ruined me." "You ruined yourself, Ricarian," Beatrice said saucily, looking down at him not with anger, but with profound pity. "You let your greed blind you to the fact that people are more than the sum of their bank accounts. You saw an old widow, and you saw weakness." Jim Callahan reached into his leather cut once more. This time, he didn't pull out an envelope of invoices. He pulled out a single, legally binding document and a heavy silver Mont Blanc pen. He dropped them onto the floor right in front of Ricarian's expensive Italian loafers. "What is this?" Ricarian mumbled, not making a move to pick it up. "It's an exit strategy," Nathaniel explained from the table. "You owe Mrs. Higgins $420,000 in stolen rent. You also owe her legal fees and punitive damages for fraud. You are currently looking at several years in federal prison for wire fraud, considering you used the Postal Service to mail those fake invoices." Ricarian squeezed his eyes shut. Tears of pure defeat leaked out. "However," Nathaniel continued, "Mama B is a generous woman. If you sign that document, you surrender your minority equity in the Oak Haven Brasserie to the Higgins estate in lieu of the debt owed. You walk away with nothing. But we drop the civil suit, and we don't hand this neat little briefcase over to the district attorney." "You're taking my restaurant?" Ricarian gasped, looking up at Beatrice. "You don't know the first thing about hospitality. You're an old woman, and these are bikers. You'll destroy the brand." "The brand is already toxic," Artie chimed in, gesturing to the wealthy patrons who were actively whispering, filming on their phones, and watching Ricarian's downfall with morbid fascination. "I won't sign it," Ricarian said, a pathetic last stand of defiance. "I built this place." "Suit yourself," Jim said, pulling his phone from his pocket. "Tommy, call Detective Ramirez down at the precinct. Let him know we've got a layup for his fraud division." "Wait!" Ricarian shrieked, scrambling forward on his hands and knees. He grabbed the silver pen. His hand shook so violently he could barely hold it. He looked at the document. It was ironclad. Immediate transfer of all assets, intellectual property, and leasehold improvements to Beatrice Higgins. With a trembling hand, Ricarian scrawled his signature across the bottom line. He dropped the pen, burying his face in his hands. Jim Callahan calmly leaned down, retrieved the document, checked the signature, and handed it to Nathaniel, who tucked it safely away in his briefcase. "Good choice, Ricarian," Beatrice said. "Now, I believe it is time for you to leave my property." Ricarian slowly stood up, brushing the dust off his ruined suit. He looked around the room, making eye contact with the hostesses, the busboys, and the waiters he had tormented for years. Not a single face offered him sympathy. He turned toward the door, walking in a daze, stepping out into the California sunshine, completely stripped of his power, his wealth, and his pride. As the door swung shut behind him, the heavy silence remained in the dining room. The patrons were unsure if they should flee or finish their overpriced appetizers. Beatrice turned away from the door and looked around the room. Her eyes landed on Lydia, the 22-year-old hostess who had refused Ricarian's order to call the police. Lydia was still standing near the wall, her eyes wide, holding the silver water pitcher. "Young lady," Beatrice called out gently. "What is your name?" Lydia jumped slightly. Lydia, ma'am. "Lydia Jenkins." "Lydia," Beatrice said, walking toward her with Jim close behind. "Ricarian mentioned you were fired just a few moments ago." "Yes, ma'am," Lydia said, her voice shaking. "I'm sorry. I couldn't call the police on you." "You have good instincts," Beatrice smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Are you in school, Lydia?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm a senior at the State University. I'm getting my degree in hospitality management." Jim Callahan let out a booming laugh that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "Well, how about that for timing, Mama B?" Beatrice nodded, a mischievous glint in her eye. She looked at Lydia, then out at the terrified dining room, and back to the young woman. "Lydia, this establishment is currently without a general manager. And seeing as I now own the entire operation, I need someone who understands hospitality, but more importantly, someone who understands integrity. Would you be interested in a rather abrupt promotion?" Lydia dropped the silver pitcher. It clattered loudly against the Italian marble. "Mean me? Mom, I'm just a hostess. I don't know if I can run a place like this." "You won't be alone," Beatrice said kindly. "I'll be bringing in a new head chef, and Nathaniel here will help you untangle the finances. But the floor is yours. Double your previous salary, full benefits, and you treat the staff with the respect they deserve. Do we have a deal?" Lydia looked at the frail old woman, then up at the towering tattooed giant standing behind her. She took a deep breath, her fear entirely replaced by overwhelming gratitude. "Yes, Mrs. Higgins. We have a deal." Beatrice smiled and patted Lydia's cheek. She turned to Jim. "All right, boys. I think my business here is concluded. Shall we go get some lunch? I hear the diner down the street makes a wonderful cherry pie." "Whatever you want, Mama B," Jim smiled, offering her his massive arm. This time she took it. As the 6 Hells Angels and the elderly widow walked slowly toward the exit, the wealthy patrons of the Oak Haven Brasserie remained frozen. But as Beatrice reached the door, Harrison Cole, the James Beard scout in the tweed jacket, slowly stood up from his booth. He didn't say a word, but he began to clap. Soon the entire dining room, the waitstaff, and the chefs peering out from the kitchen joined in. A thunderous applause followed Beatrice Higgins and her leather-clad guardians out the door, the sound of clapping soon drowned out by the roaring triumphant thunder of 6 Harley-Davidson engines tearing out of the valet lot. The pristine doors of Oakhaven Brasserie remained open, but its soul had entirely shifted. Ricarian Sanders' arrogant empire collapsed in a single afternoon, dismantled by the very people he deemed unworthy to walk through his doors. It stands as a profound reminder that respect is a universal currency, and arrogance blinds you to the reality that a leather vest might just carry more authority than a tailored silk suit.